Good afternoon, welcome back. I'm going to try something a little bit different today. I was on the website chesshistory.com when I found a page all about Alexander McDonnell. There's a link down below. In the middle of this page, there is a reproduction of a column that was published in the Chess Players Chronicle in 1846, and it's an 1834 letter from McDonnell to another chess player asking for some help. So I'm just going to take you through it. So the following letter of McDonnell's, addressed to a leading metropolitan player during the progress of the celebrated contest against Bourdonnais in 1834, will be read with interest by every amateur of chess. So McDonnell says, "My dear sir, I am much obliged to you for your friendly letter, which I received on Saturday evening. I acknowledge I am sensitive and nervous in playing, more on account of the kind of partiality of friends than from personal anxiety about the games. I cannot get over this, and I fear it will be fatal to my success. Let us not, however, underrate the Frenchman's powers. He is the most finished player of the age, and all I can expect is to play up to him after some practice. The openings may not be happy, but how can you mend them? I broke down in my bishop's gambit the game of all others I most relied on, and possibly it would be the same with any other attacking game. The fact is, practice of a superior kind is indispensable to form a first-rate player. I am sure Bourdonnais will play king's pawn 1 square in all the games until he gets the ascendancy. You may think it odd, but I cannot mend my opening. I am exceedingly busy just now, but I wish you would look quietly at the following sketch and send me, in the course of Wednesday, all the variations you can, as I have not a moment to analyse myself this critical mode of playing the king pawn 1 game." And then he gives the moves, and it's in descriptive notation. It's the old way of describing a chess game. We use algebraic notation today, which is easier for most people. But he gives the moves, and then he gives some comments, and he ends with, "On the whole, this king's pawn 1 square is a most perplexing game, and I think all the ways laid down in the books give the second player the best game. I am, my dear sir, yours most faithfully, Alexander McDonnell. Imagine yourself the Frenchman winning the above game by correspondence." Okay, so let's go through his moves. King's pawn 2, queen's bishop pawn 2, so the Sicilian, and McDonnell has a note here. He says, "This prevents the advantageous exchanges of pawns as you suggest." So he's talking to his friend there. The game continues. King's bishop pawn 2, so f4. This is the Sicilian McDonnell attack. And we go queen's knight to bishop 3rd, queen's bishop pawn 1, king's pawn 1. So this is the move that McDonnell is using to describe this whole opening, king's pawn 1, as he said in his letter 2 or 3 times. And there's more than one way to get to this position, as we saw in game 9. In game 9 we had king's pawn 1 right at the start, so the French defence going into the French defence Bourdonnais variation. And this is just a way of getting into the same position that we see via the Sicilian. And we now have king's knight to bishop 3rd, queen's pawn 2 striking in the centre, king's pawn 1. So the numbers, when they say whatever pawn 1, is just you move 1 move ahead. It's not about the rank numbers. King's bishop pawn 1. So f6, queen's knight to rook 3rd here. And McDonnell has his second note here. He says, "Novel, and I think the best." But we have Stockfish to help us, and Stockfish says that d4 is actually slightly better, but not by much. So we'll accept this from McDonnell. It's probably going to be okay. And then we have the other knight to rook 3rd, and queen's knight to queen's bishop 2nd. Queen's knight to queen's bishop 2nd. Queen to knight 3rd, so knight 3rd. Queen's pawn 2, so finally getting round to d4 like Stockfish wanted. McDonnell got there in the end and everything is fine. And we have the pawn takes the queen's pawn, and then the queen's bishop pawn takes the pawn, and then queen's bishop to queen 2nd. King's rook pawn 2, so h4. And McDonnell's third note comes in here. He says, either very bad or very good. So, okay, it could be very bad or it could be very good, but we know with the engine that the engine says the game actually just went from a draw to black winning by about a pawn. So not great, not terrible either. So I don't agree with this comment there. It's not very bad and it's not very good. But whichever way, we'll carry on. Queen's rook to queen's bishop. Bishop to king second. And we have another note. He says, I played queen's knight generally too soon to king's third. So he thinks that this move he's played too soon in the past, and he thinks that this is an improvement. And we carry on with king's bishop checks with a note. Bishop to king second, castles. Can anything be done by Bourdonnais this way? It seems too tame for his style. So that'll be bishop to e7 and then some intermediate move and then castles. And it turns out that this is actually just as good as checking straight away. So let's go for that. Bishop to b4 check. King to bishop second and black castles. And McDonnell immediately plays king to knight third. And he says, novel, certainly, but can you prove it bad? Well, the engine says that this loses another center pawn, and king to g1 would be better. By going to g3, then white is now down the equivalent of 2 pawns, so pretty bad. And the game continues with bishop's pawn takes pawn, and bishop's pawn retakes, and now the knight checks, so knight to f5. With a note, can any sacrifice here be made safely? So I think what he is talking about is white maybe coming and taking one of these pawns and sacrificing the knight, one of these 2 center pawns, and it actually turns out that this isn't safe for Bourdonnais. If you were to take with the knight one of these pawns at this point, then white still has the opportunity to hide his king and get all his pieces under protection and carry on with an advantage of a knight for 1 or 2 pawns. So the answer is no, it can't be done safely. So knight checks on f5, the king moves out of the way, king to rook third, king's rook pawn 2, king's knight pawn 2, pawn takes pawn, king takes pawn. And McDonnell has a final note. He says, look at the position of the king. Anyone would swear it was a game of mine, but is it bad? Or can you show me in any way how an attack can be formed? Well, in actual fact, the game went from being about equal to white being down nearly a whole queen with the g4 move. What McDonnell should play here is rook to f1, getting more pieces into the game and maintaining equivalency. But this just loses, so we'll see how that goes. We'll go forward. We'll give an example line. Bourdonnais may now sacrifice the knight on e5 because, well, we'll follow an example line just to demonstrate. If the pawn captures back, the queen can come to f2. The rook might try to help in defense, but this rook can capture the knight. The queen captures back. The knight comes to d4. It can't be captured by this knight because it's needed for the protection of this rook now. So the queen moves out of the way, but now the bishop is lost. And we end up exchanging down a few pieces. And as you can see, black has more pawns, and he also has more pieces. So this ends up being a big advantage and a winning position for Bourdonnais. And, well, that's it. So, in conclusion, I think that McDonnell will probably be better off forgetting this line of attack with the king's pawn 1 game. We'll see in future games what he ends up deciding. Thanks for joining us for this slightly different format. I very much enjoyed the descriptive notation today, and please join me again next time.